Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us for tonight's program, celebrating Hispanic and Latinx art. My name is Helen Liu, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Carey Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Carey Library Foundation, whose mission is to raise private funds for the library. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. I want to also thank the Friends of the Carey Library. Their support enables the library to provide reduced price admission passes to local attractions and museums, like the Museum of Fine Arts, for those who work and live in Lexington. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat. I will also post a link to the evaluation form, so please take a moment to share your thoughts about this program. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Layla Bermeo is the Kristin and Roger Servison Curator of Paintings and the Art of the Americas Department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Before joining the MFA in 2016, she co-curated the Black History, Art History Performance Art Series at Harvard University, held curatorial fellowships at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and served as a guest curator at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. She holds a bachelor's degree from Northwestern University, an MA from the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art, and she is currently a Ph.D. candidate at Harvard University. At the MFA, Layla co-organized Collecting Stories, Native American Art, and curated Frida Kahlo and Art Popular. The forthcoming retrospective catalog on the Kahlo exhibition will be the MFA's first bilingual English-Spanish publication. Please join me in welcoming Layla.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that warm welcome. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight to learn a little bit about some of the art in the MFA's collection. I'm just going to share my screen. So as Helen mentioned, I am a curator of paintings at the MFA, which stands on the homelands of the Algonquian peoples, so including the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, just like in Lexington. And these are people who continue to care for this land. Even though we are meeting today in a virtual room, I want us to kind of envision that we're walking through the museum together. So imagine that also the weather is much better today, and we're kind of walking up these steps through the door at the Huntington Avenue entrance, and then we'll cross through the rotunda and we'll wind up here in front of the Art of the Americas wing, which opened in 2010. Often people still refer to it as the new American wing because it feels new, even though at this point it's over 10 years old. So I joined the staff of the Art of the Americas department about 5 years ago, and I am the very first Latina curator in the 150-year history of the Museum of Fine Arts. I'd always wanted to work in this department, in the Art of the Americas department, because it is quite intentionally plural. So when we say American art at the MFA, we don't just mean the art of the United States. We're actually responsible for collecting, presenting, and interpreting art from all across Canada, Latin America, including island nations and indigenous nations. And when you walk into our galleries, and maybe some of you have been there before, you'll see that there is still an imbalance in terms of the representation of artists of color and artists working outside of the United States. Most of the works in our collection, especially really some of the icons, were made by white artists and usually for privileged white art collectors. And so this is something that it's sort of like an if you build it, they will come, where the ambition of our department is more than what you might see at first. But it's really the inclusive vision. I think you kind of have to have both a vision and a space before you can really make significant changes. And in the last couple of years, we've really made dramatic strides in expanding the spaces, the exhibitions, and also the acquisitions, meaning works of art that we buy or that enter the collection of the MFA, to include more artists of color. And today we'll be talking specifically, and also artists who are working throughout Latin America. So as we're kind of thinking about how we are going to honor Hispanic and Latinx Heritage Month, today we're going to be talking about some highlights of works of art that were made by Latin American and Latinx artists. So on the far left, you can see examples from our collection of ancient American art. So even before European contact, there were already many different people speaking many different languages from many different cultural backgrounds, making a lot of art long before anybody from Europe showed up in the Americas. The strengths of our collection are really in what is now present day Latin America, which those are the examples that you're seeing on the left there. On the top, gold from Panama, and on the bottom, Maya ceramics, which we're going to spend some time talking about. Towards the middle of the slide, you'll see some examples of Spanish colonial art. These would be works of art from about the 1700s, from the 18th century, that really mix together indigenous or native influences as well as Spanish. And then our collection also includes works by artists who are working in Latin America, of course, like the iconic Frida Kahlo, working in Mexico, as well as Latinx artists. And by Latinx, we tend to mean artists of Latin American descent who have spent their careers and lives here in the United States, whether they were born here or, like Luchita Hurtado, who we will talk about, moved here. So let's get started on the lower level of the Art of the Americas wing. So you have to imagine that we are walking down these stairs and then we kind of wind up standing in this remarkable gallery of Maya art. And one of the great highlights of this gallery is this painted cylinder vase that is from about 755 to 780 AD, what's known as the late classic period among Maya scholars. The Maya people they still live today in southern Mexico and into Guatemala, and this is from what is now Guatemala. This cylinder would have been a vessel probably for drinking as part of religious ceremonies. It's really not something that would have been used by kind of everyday people, but something that Maya nobility would have used. And the form, I will say, is not that unusual. Like, there are many, many versions of these kinds of ceramic cylinder vases. What is unusual and really, really important and remarkable is the style of painting, which you can kind of get a glimpse of here, but we can see more of in this kind of digital rollout of what the entire painted surface looks like. So in the middle, we're seeing the corn god or maize god. And this is a scene of his birth, even though he is kind of depicted as an adult, and he's flanked by two other supernatural beings. This white cord that you see sort of twisting around and uniting the scene represents the umbilical cord from his birth. And this is something that, you know, if you're looking at it as the kind of cylinder, it would encourage you to kind of turn the vase around in order to see the entire image, which again, here we can kind of view it flattened. And that, you know, to me has kind of like a cinematic quality if we're thinking about the way that one would have sort of used and looked at this remarkable vase. It's painted with what's called slip paint, which is pigment that's derived from, you know, natural sources mixed with water, kind of like watercolor. And it's important to kind of note the incredible variance of colors, especially on the bodies, something that would have been incredibly difficult to accomplish with this style of painting. And this is how we know it's a great master. The Maya not only had incredibly sophisticated methods of painting, but also of writing. So we can see in the upper corners here some hieroglyphics, and they offer the date of the birth of this corn god or maize god. This to me is really particularly interesting because it shows that Maya had such a kind of sophisticated method of time or thinking of time and creating calendars, that there were dates for things that happened before human creation. The black background here denotes that this is sort of in an ancient time before the creation of humans, and yet they've still developed a kind of calendar system to sort of keep track of this time. It is really like an unbelievable kind of worldview. This cylinder is on view with this beautiful carved shell that we're seeing in the lower right. And that is actually a tool for making the paint, for making this style of painting. So it's a palette. And we actually recently acquired this. So it's a carved conch shell, carved into the form of a hand, and it would have actually sat in the hand of the painter and been filled with pigments and water. When I was reviewing my slides earlier, I was thinking about this object and, questioning myself, would this have been considered a work of art at the time, or was it just an artist's tool? And so, would essentially this be considered to be on the same level as this incredible painted face? And then, I kind of realized that the point here is not really like what is art and what is not art, but the fact that kind of an artistic vision infused even the most functional objects among the Maya people. So we're going to walk up the steps from that gallery into what maybe those of you who visited the MFA before might be familiar with. One of absolutely our most iconic installations is in this first gallery that we call Boston on the Eve of Revolution. So this is if you're kind of walking directly into the wing, it's what's right on the floor level. And many people experience this gallery as the entrance to the Art of the Americas wing. More recently, many of our visitors have told us that they don't see themselves in this installation, this very sort of important and iconic installation of John Singleton Copley's portrait of Paul Revere and the Liberty Bowl right here. And that's a good, it's a good point that this is not a gallery that represents lots of different perspectives or lots of different types of people. So you walk in and these kind of rows and rows of white faces don't look like Boston now, certainly, but honestly, they didn't really look like Boston back in 1776 either, when there would have been many more people of indigenous descent and as well as and people of African descent who are not represented here. And so, we have been thinking for a long time about how to kind of change up some of the stories in this gallery. And the fact is that it is harder because this installation with Paul Revere and the Liberty Bowl is so iconic, because it is so meaningful to our local histories here and is really a touchstone for a lot of schools that come to visit us as well. So it's, how do you sort of change that up? And then when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we also had the new question of how do you change something when you cannot access your galleries to move around objects? This is a challenge that as a curator, I really like, because I think that we can do a lot with what we call the interpretation or the storytelling without really changing, without really having to move a lot of galleries, right? We have things to help us. We have labels that we write. We have an audio tour. We have ways that we can present material differently. And in this case, even working from afar. So Helen had mentioned that I had organized a couple of years ago an exhibition on Frida Kahlo, and that was one of our special exhibitions that was only up for a couple of months, and we did the whole thing with bilingual English-Spanish labels. People loved that so much. Even people who did not speak Spanish told me how much they loved seeing the bilingual labels, because they felt that it kind of added to the story. Even just being able to sort of see it, it sort of told something about the culture that these objects are from. And that the success of that made me really start wondering if language could also serve a similar function here in this gallery. If we were able to include language labels in lots of different languages, would that open up the stories that we could tell? Would that enhance the kind of international connections that we know are here with these objects in this early period of what would become the United States? So thinking about this project, which would come to be known as the Translation Project, our sort of entry point, the kind of object that really inspired us, was the Liberty Bowl. So the Liberty Bowl, some of you may know, is often considered to be as important as the Declaration of Independence as a kind of founding document. So this was a bowl that was made by Paul Revere himself around 1768, and it would have actually been completely illegal to make this bowl because it was created in protest to taxes from the British. And all around the top edge of the bowl are engraved the names of people who were voting to reject the taxes from the British. So these are essentially people who would have been in rebellion of the British rule at the time, and they could have been arrested even if this bowl had been seen by, you know, anybody, any kind of British leadership. So it's one of those things that, you know, now it kind of sits very obediently in this like museum case, but it's really important to think of it as a completely radical kind of object. And it's hard to think of an object that could be more closely tied to the early history of the United States. Again, part of the kind of foundational declaration of independence from British rule made by Paul Revere himself here in Boston. But the question that I love to ask about this object is, where did the silver come from to make it? There was not silver in Boston at the time. There was not silver in the United States at the time. The silver would have been mined probably from Mexico by indigenous people who would have been enslaved by the Spanish. And the silver would have come out of those mines, gone back to Europe, and kind of been fed back into the Americas through trade routes. And so this object already, even though it is so closely bound to the histories of the United States, it has a Latin American history inside of it. And not only that, but when Paul Revere created this bowl, he created it in the form of a Chinese vessel. And so it also has a kind of Chinese story to it as well. We could kind of begin to envision here how we might be able to have labels for this object, not just in English, but also in Spanish and Chinese, to kind of open up again these international histories and invite more people to identify with this object that seemed so kind of belonging only to the history of the US. We sent out a call for participation to everybody working at the MFA, because we were interested in not using professional translators, but really in drawing from the talent of our own staff and people who had connections to the MFA. And so initially we had thought that we would introduce texts in Spanish, Chinese, and Haitian Creole. I think that the only bilingual museum in the United States is the Phoenix Museum. So if you go to the art museum in Phoenix, Arizona, every sign, every label that is with a work of art is in English and Spanish. And that's because that was an incredible initiative, but it's also because it is pretty obvious that in Phoenix, the second most spoken language after English is Spanish. And that is not the case in Boston. It's actually quite interesting that almost as many people speak Mandarin Chinese here and speak Haitian Creole here as speak Spanish. And so we sort of knew immediately that we would need to do not just bilingual labels, but multilingual labels. And this was our first attempt to, instead of just having labels in different languages for special exhibitions that are only up for a couple of months, to bringing them into our permanent collection galleries. So associating them more tightly with the kind of icons in our collection, like Paul Revere and the Liberty Bowl and other works by John Singleton Copley. We put together an amazing team of contributors who spoke not only Spanish, Chinese, Haitian Creole, but also Brazilian Portuguese. We added that after insistence from someone on our own staff. And in addition to current and former MFA staff, there were also some local artists involved as well. This idea came about because I have looked at some truly horrific Spanish translations in my time at the museum that had come from professional translation companies. And that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that like I know the language better than professional translators, because I don't. It's that I know the language of museums better. And so this was a way that we could really get into the kind of nuances of storytelling at a museum by drawing on talent from within. And I would say specifically drawing on diversity from within. Museums, like other institutions, are at a moment when they are sort of tearing their hair out, trying to figure out how to be more diverse and how to reach new audiences. And often the first impulse is to actually look outside of the museum, when there tend to be many people from diverse backgrounds who are working security, who are working in the cafeteria, who are working IT and in education. And so this project was very much about drawing from both the talent and the diversity that was already within the MFA. Thanks to this amazing team of contributors, the Liberty Bowl now has 5 different labels. So we're looking at it from the front and we're seeing English on the top and Haitian Creole on the bottom. And then the other sides have Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, and Brazilian Portuguese. Also important here is that we did not just simply write new labels and then have them translated. This group of contributors actually helped us determine what the story should be. So we created brand new labels, new content in collaboration with people who, quite frankly, are not usually part of that process. Paul Revere now is hanging next to a sign that explains this project, which is titled Translating American Stories. And the first line of that kind of description of the project says, "English is a foreign language in the Americas," perhaps one of the favorite lines that I've ever written. And Paul Revere has a label in also that is bilingual in English and in Spanish. And here we can kind of see, I know it's like hard to read on the screen, but the ways also that using different languages can open up different models for thinking about people. So in Spanish, we have a word, estadounidense, which means of the United States. So we don't use americano as frequently because people from other parts of the Americas, including Latin America, are also americano. And so estadounidense, which we don't have a word for United Statesian in English, can be used really effectively here in a way that I think is really exciting. There's also an audio guide for this. So we have an MFA app that can be downloaded, and you actually don't have to be in the museum to put it on your phone, but there is an audio tour, and you can actually kind of see even on my screen here, the Liberty Bowl, and it is also presented in both English and Spanish, and the person who reads the labels in both languages, again, is not a sort of like professional speaker, but Jason Medina Restrepo, who along with Daniela Sierra, both of them work here on staff at the MFA. Jason works in our development department. Daniela is our department assistant of contemporary art. They did this translation themselves. And so Jason is actually the voice of this label on the audio guide. So moving upstairs. Oh no, we're not moving upstairs yet. Just kidding. So we're just going around the corner. So we're still on this level. And if we're facing Paul Revere and we've walked to the left, we wind up in our gallery of Spanish colonial art. This was a gallery that opened in 2010 when the Art of the Americas wing first opened, kind of as a way to begin to open up stories, not just about New England, but also about New Spain and other parts of the Americas that were colonized by the Spanish. In this gallery, this is interesting because this is an old picture of the gallery, and it's actually, the collection has grown since then. And one of the most important works of art from this part of the collection is actually not in this gallery. It is in the wall that is right outside of it. And that is because the collection has grown so much that now the objects are kind of migrating outside of that space. One of the decisions that museum curators have to make when you have a small group of objects, like a small group of Latin American art, in this case, Spanish colonial art, is do you sort of spread them out, or are they more powerful altogether? And I think the decision early on when the building first opened was to keep them all together. But since then, we have actually been able to begin spreading them out as we've developed this collection. So we are looking at a desk and bookcase that was made in the mid 18th century, so the mid 1700s in Puebla, which is a big city in Mexico. And it's the same object. So on the left, it is closed, and on the right, it is open. So you can see this incredible interior. This object entered the collection shortly after my colleague Dennis Carr did an exhibition called Made in the Americas, which examined Asian influences in colonial Latin American art. So we often don't think of the influences of Asia in Latin America, but an object like this goes really far to show us how important these influences would have been. So looking on the left, all of that incredible inlaid wood, the designs are derived from Islamic architectural designs because the Islamic influences in Spain, particularly in tile and architecture, were so strong that they really came to the Americas with the Spanish and were recreated, particularly in big urban centers like Puebla and Mexico City. When you open up the chest, you see this incredible gold and red painted interior that looks a lot like chinoiserie or sort of European textiles and other kinds of designs that would have been inspired by Chinese fabrics. So the sort of red and gold, something that in the period would have been highly associated with Chinese, again, textiles, fabrics, and decorative arts, but also would have been important to indigenous people in Mexico. And an object like this, which requires so many different types of skills, so wood carving, inlay, but then also this incredible painted interior, which is actually a map of land nearby. And it shows images of people of African descent, both enslaved and free. The skills required here suggest that it was probably more than one hand, so multiple people, and probably a mix of indigenous people and Hispanic people, or people that were from either directly from Spain or what we call criollo or Creole people, people from Spain who were born here in the Americas, but sort of ethnically still Spanish. So probably a mix of hands of people from a mix of different backgrounds. And then kind of also showing the diversity of different people who would have also been in Mexico at the time, including people of African descent. We love to use this object as a way to show that globalism was not new with the internet, that globalism has been sort of alive and well kind of since the beginning of the Americas. This desk and bookcase is installed with 3 Casta paintings. Casta or cast paintings is a really unique and kind of specific form of colonial Mexican painting. So I mentioned that the desk was made in Puebla. The paintings were probably also made in either Mexico City or Puebla. It tends to be a kind of an urban form of painting. And Casta paintings, kind of like the desk and bookcase, actually also address different forms of racial and cultural mixing, but in a different way. And so Casta paintings are a form of export art, meaning that they were made in Mexico, but for audiences in Europe. And the idea was that they were sent to European stakeholders, so people who either had money invested or some kind of stake in the colonial project in the Americas. And they were sent to them to kind of ease anxieties, to show that all of the racial mixing that was happening in the Americas was happening in a kind of orderly way. And so they attempt to categorize men and women from different backgrounds and their mixed race children. They're usually numbered on fairly small panels. Ours are painted on copper, which is a little unusual. Often they're on wood panel or canvas. And they're typically created in sets of 16. And that's why you see at the bottom there a little number 1. So each of these paintings would have been numbered and captioned. And there's a lot of variety in them. Many people have tried to sort of impose some kind of like standard way of creating the 16 different panels, but there are actually very few consistencies between different sets of these forms of paintings. One of the very few consistencies is that the first painting, number 1, is always the same. So I always say like number 1 is number 1, like in every set of Casta paintings. So number 1 is always de español e india nace mestizo. From a Spaniard man, always a man, it's always gendered this way, and an Indian woman, a mestizo is born, a mestizo or mixed race child. This set has a number 1 and a number 2. And so here in number 2, we see de español y mestiza nace castizo, from a Spaniard and mestiza, so a Spanish man, and mestiza, a mixed race woman. A castizo is born, this new term introduced here, castizo. Two you will see often as kind of standard, but what happens is the further along that you get with these sets, and the reason why we have a 1, a 2, and a number 7 is because these paintings would have been created in sets of 16 and then broken up and kind of sold individually. So we're lucky to even have like a 1 and a 2 consecutive. And then the third one that we have is a number 7, which something completely different happens here. De Español y Albina nace y torna atrás. So from a Spanish man and a albino woman, a return backwards is born. So that is not a castizo is maybe sort of a real person. Mestizo, sure, a mixed race person of, indigenous and Spanish descent. A torna atrás is nothing. That is a nonsense word that was maybe occasionally used. But what pictures like this show us is how these categories always fall apart, that they are kind of intended to sort of be created in a series, showing some kind of nearly mathematical organization. But this sort of organization, because it is so artificial, because you cannot put people in boxes, always falls apart by number 5 or 7. And so these are paintings that really tend to captivate our audience members. I would say specifically our audience members of African and Latin American descent, because it is so rare that, especially earlier in the history of painting in our galleries, that you see people of color represented at all. And even though they are represented in this kind of problematic way, we do get a lot of interest in them being sort of there at all, and in this sort of history of mixing being shown so kind of straightforwardly, whereas we don't really have an equivalent of that in the United States, although you could have, right? There's a lot of mixing in the United States as well. It just happens to be that this form of painting was only created by leaders and artists in Mexico at the time. So we're going to take a big jump for our last sort of, 10 to 15 minutes here. And we're going to walk up 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor. And the reason that we are doing that is because our building is organized chronologically, as you've probably gotten the feel for. So Ancient Americas is in the lower level. The first level is colonial or 18th century American art. The second level, some of you might know, is where our incredible collection of John Singer Sargent paintings are. That's the 19th century or the 1800s. And on that entire floor, there is not a single object of Latin American art. It is a major gap in our collection, and one that I hope to work toward reconciling it. But I don't think that you can have an Art of the Americas wing and lose an entire century of Latin American art. And so that is something to know, that like even, again, as we sort of set out with these ambitions and these visions, there are still in our collection. And so we're going to go up one more floor to the 3rd floor, which is where our collection of modern art is usually presented. And right now, for a couple more weeks here, we have a really interesting presentation of modern art organized into a temporary exhibition called Women Take the Floor. And what our lead curator, my colleague Noni Gadsden, has done here is clear out all of the galleries of modern art and place only works by women in these galleries, and really show how you can tell the entire story of modern art, including abstraction and other kind of serious movements, images of urban life, the kinds of importance of photography and dialogues between photography and painting, with only works by women artists. This was a really interesting project that anytime that you have a project on, artists who have been historically marginalized, there are pros and cons to that. So one of the pros is that you get to sort of create a space for these artists where they sort of strengthen each other. And many people got to sort of meet or encounter artists that they had never heard of before, work that had maybe been in the collection but had not been on view. Artists, women artists who should have gotten their due long ago but hadn't. And so those are really kind of amazing things about creating a space specifically for women artists. One of the sort of drawbacks can be that it feels like segregation, right? That it feels like women artists can somehow not stand up to a broader installation that would include works by men as well. And so we had lots of challenging conversations about what this installation would look like. And I would say I was like maybe particularly skeptical, but having seen especially the visitor responses has really kind of shifted my understanding of the importance of a project like this. And this project includes work by both Latin American and Latina or Latinx artists. And so one of the first things that you see when you walk in is our remarkable double portrait by Frida Kahlo, which was acquired in 2016. It's a pretty remarkable thing to be able to have a painting by Frida Kahlo in a public collection like the MFA. So we are one of only, there's about 12 of them in public collections in the US, and this is one of them. It's the only one in New England. And the reason for that is because works by Frida Kahlo are cultural patrimony, meaning that you could not just like fly down to Mexico City, get a Frida Kahlo and bring it back. Since the 1980s, works by Kahlo, her husband Diego Rivera, and several other artists have not been permitted to leave the country. And so how did we get this one? We got it recently, only in 2016, but it was because it's one of the first paintings that Kahlo ever personally sold, and she happened to sell it to someone who lived in New York City. And so in 1928, he bought the painting directly from Kahlo, packed it up in his suitcase, brought it back to New York, and it stayed in New York City until 2015 when it came to the MFA. It's a really remarkable painting, and it's a remarkable like early work by her where she is picturing people who she knew well. These were the muchachas, or the domestic workers who worked for her mother and later also for her. And so the kind of intimacy that we see in the kind of closeness of their bodies, which is sort of pressed up because of that thick floral background. It really, I think, speaks to the intimacy that Kahlo had with these subjects. And so this transformative work was the subject of an exhibition that I did in 2019. And as Helen mentioned at the beginning, I'm currently writing a retrospective catalog, which will come out next year. And it will be the MFA's very first publication that is bilingual in English and Spanish. Many of the galleries that are in this installation in Women Take the Floor made me see our historic galleries differently. And for that, I'm very grateful to be able to kind of experience that. So we're looking right now at a gallery that has the most amazing name. It's called No Man's Land, and it is a gallery of landscape art, all by women artists. So very appropriately named No Man's Land. And I think one of the most compelling works in this installation, which made me think again a lot about how in the 19th century galleries, so just the floor right below, not only do we not have any work by Latin American artists or Latinx artists in that entire sort of display, but the landscapes are completely dominated by men artists. So we don't have any women landscape artists on view. And it was quite moving to see in the 20th century how we could do a full gallery of landscape art by women artists. And it includes a really interesting work by Luchita Hurtado, who we see on the far left there, and you can get a little bit closer to her. So again, Latina or Latinx artists are those who make their lives here in the United States. So she was born in Venezuela, but came here when she was young, and really her whole kind of artistic life took place between New York and Taos, New Mexico, was also where she spent a lot of time, which you can maybe see some of the inspiration of the Southwestern landscape in this painting. This painting is probably a version of a self-portrait. She did a series of these kind of explorations of her own body. And here, we could imagine maybe she's laying down and kind of looking down, and that's where some of this wonderful compression happens. On the right side, this sort of sand dune becomes a breast. We can see the sort of dip of the navel and the rise of a knee, and these wonderful kind of toes in the background. when I look at this painting, I think a lot about how important the moon is up here, which is such a tiny detail. But if it wasn't there, it would completely transform our understanding of the scale of this picture, right? Or this body that we're looking at. And so I love thinking about how that little moon really sets the scale of this entire picture. And if we imagine that that in fact is a woman who is sort of laying down or reclining, how big would she be if she stood up? The painting itself is also not very big. It's maybe like this big. And so it's a lot of sort of narrative tension that is packed into this really kind of small scale. Again, one of the great strengths of Women Take the Floor is the kind of difference in media, and you can get a sense of that here where you're seeing design objects. This is actually a wonderful painting by a Cuban artist who was sort of in dialogue in the 50s with things that were happening in abstraction. Lolo Solbe is that artist's name. And then here, Carmen Herrera was also from Cuba, but she would be considered Latino or Latinx at this point, as really her whole career has taken place here in the US. And at the same time, I think there's something to be said for the way that both like Latin American artists and Latinx artists, people working here in the US, have really been overlooked in terms of their development of abstraction. And it's interesting to have both here in this gallery an artist who spent her life in Cuba and an artist who came here to the US, similarly exploring abstraction. Carmen Herrera became really interested in like how she could reduce her use of color and how she could reduce shapes and sort of make a painting with the least elements possible. So like the least amount of color and really sort of just playing with the productiveness of a single line or of one or two shapes. And so this is called Blanco y Verde, white and green. And it's interesting what happens, you know, when you look at the sort of simplicity of this work in the way that she kind of positions those two triangles in that upper sort of quarter of the canvas, makes them all of a sudden seem like they're referencing a horizon line or maybe some kind of landscape. Our brains sort of kind of fill in what this painting could reference. And that was something that I think she was really interested in the ways that like we're able to look at something that is very simple and see many more things past it. And so she did all of these really experimental work, especially in the 60s. But at this point, she is still alive. She is 106 years old and she is still painting. She is still making work. And both Herrera and Hurtado really didn't come to prominence until much later in their lives. Hurtado's story is very similar to that of many women artists, where she worked for a long time on her husband's archives. She worked to sort of like promote, she was married to another artist, she worked to sort of promote and archive his work. And her career really sort of fell by the side as she attended to his. And then very recently, like in like 2019, a big gallery in London, Serpentine, had an exhibition of hers and it like blew everyone's mind. Like everyone was like, wow, who is this painter? And she had been, working for all of this time. And she died very recently in 2020, but she did get to sort of see her work come to prominence before she died. And the same thing is true of Herrera, who is still alive and still working, and who, within maybe the last 10 years has become really kind of famous in within discussions, especially of abstraction, and not really tied completely to Latin America or to the US. She's really sort of seen as someone who is important, in the sort of history of abstraction. And she has spoken very openly about how she knows that she fell through the cracks for so long because she's a woman and because she's a person of Cuban descent. But I find this very inspiring, a kind of inspiring note to sort of wrap up on, that Herrera was born in 1915 and has had a very, very long life. And through that life has seen, I think, art change, definitions of art change. She's seen definitions of Hispanic, of Latino, Latina, Latinx change. And she's still part of it in the way that like all of these histories are also still kind of continuing to evolve. So I'm going to stop speaking there and just want to mention quickly, like, I had said that Women Take the Floor ends pretty soon. It ends in November. And always the big question is what comes next with these galleries of modern art. So we're going to be reinstalling that entire top floor again. And this time I'm actually working on a gallery that is specifically devoted to Latin American art. And so this is what things look like when we're planning installations. We do like a paper doll thing. You can kind of see on the left where we like print out little itty bitty maquettes of the paintings and we move them around with pieces of tape and post-its on a big floor plan. And on the right is the more techie version that our designer has made, where you can kind of see how things start to fit together. So there's the Kahlo with some other works on paper from our collection, an incredible David Alfaro Siqueiros that was acquired also fairly recently in 2018. And this gallery may also include some works by Latinx artists, so artists who have worked here in the US as well. I don't know, I'm still thinking about it, but I hope that you will all be able to come and see it when it opens up later in the spring. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. I think you can type them in the chat. We're also like a small enough group that I think you can also just like shout them out if you like. And I think Helen had posed one question, a couple of questions in advance, which I can go ahead and speak to. And the first kind of question that had been suggested was about what inspired me to become a curator, which I think is a great question. And one that is very interesting, one that I like to think about a lot, because I didn't actually know the word curator until I was almost done with college. It was, even though I grew up in like a working class family in the Midwest, but we did often go to museums. So we went to college museums and other places that we had access to. And so it wasn't complete, like going to museums was not foreign to me, but I had really never thought about who decided what work of art went on the wall, or who wrote the label, whose voice is that represented on the label when you encounter a work of art and you read about it, who writes that? Until very, very late kind of in the game. I think growing up in like an immigrant family, a working class family, there were sort of the options were like be a doctor or a lawyer. And in college, it was like pretty clear that that was like not working out for me. And when I had sort of turned my attention to art history, I had an internship at the Art Institute of Chicago early on. And all of a sudden it was like, I just realized that I had all of these questions about how museums work and who is in charge and why some museums are so deep in certain works of art and have no representation in other works of art. And those are still the questions that I am kind of working through today. So those are not questions that sort of go away even after you kind of dedicate your life to them. So, at this point, like after undergrad, I worked in a commercial gallery for a couple of years, and then I got a master's degree and started doing a lot more hands-on curatorial work at the Williams College Museum of Art. So college museums are always really near and dear to my heart. They are often able to do really interesting work that you don't see at like larger museums. They tend to be more nimble. I think because they have student communities, they tend to incorporate points of view that quite frankly are much more radical than like what you might see at like an MFA or a Met. And so, that was a really important experience for me. Oh yeah, and someone here is from Williams, yay! Yeah, no, so I'm sure you're probably familiar with that. In fact, like art history is like, which was very new to me, but like they still have some crazy percentage of the student body takes art history. It's like 80% or something like that, which was not the case at Northwestern where I went to undergrad. But yeah, their college museum, and it's also the graduate program is actually housed in the Clark Art Institute. So it's like Williams is this, tiny corner in a tiny state, and it is so rich in art. So that was a really formative experience for me. And basically, once I knew what a curator was and did, I never wanted to do anything else. And quite frankly, I don't think I can do anything. This is like the only thing that I do. Yeah, no, right. If you had taken art history earlier, you would have been a major. Yeah, totally.
So I'm sure you know that the Williams College Museum of Art is going to change its location.
Yes, I do know that. I do know that because I am friends with their former curator, Horace Ballard, who is now at the Harvard Art Museums, which is amazing. So we'll be able to see his work. But he had talked to me a little bit about that, and it's going where the old Williams Inn.
Yes,
right?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, I feel like that might be good. Like it's sort of at like, and as long as they make a parking lot, right? It's sort of at like a good like access point. One of the questions that Horace had raised, which is so fascinating, was about the works of art that during World War II were placed in storage. So like quite famously, if you have seen the Clark Art Institute, you know that it looks a little bit like a burial chamber or something like that. But like works of art were stored there for safety during World War II from both like the college collection, what became the college collections, and also from the MFA. So our archivist has this wonderful wooden sign that says like museum closed due to war or like for the duration of war or something. And we sent works of art out there to be stored for safety. So there's interesting connections, I think, between our two museums and also just like as a collection, that collection is so interesting and has done, I think, so well to incorporate a lot of the important work that is done by faculty. So I was very impressed, recently they had an incredible show called Access Mundo, speaking of like Latinx or Chicanx art, that was about Chicano artists by Ondine Chavoya, who has taught there and been incredibly influential there for years and years. And that was like something, I think I like sent him a text message that was like, you would never see, like it had a very radical image as the key image, which was like blown up on this enormous banner, this like young Chicano, like queer guy that, I was like, I can't imagine that like on the front of like these like older, like stodgier institutions.
They also, one of the benefits of moving the location is space, because they are doing so much with incorporating art into all kinds of classes, not just art history or studio art classes, but every class goes to the art museum to learn about observation and to learn about all kinds of things. So it's really, they're excited to have more space. But my daughter, who just walked away, had a question for you. She wanted to ask you what some of your favorite works of art are.
Yeah, that is so hard. So they had also given me that as like a question to think about too. And it's like, I wish, I have never in my life had a good answer for that question. And I'm not sure what my problem is. And I don't know if other art historians are able to answer that question better than I am. I don't know if it's sort of like who's your favorite child or like what my problem is. And also, the thing is like I don't work on sometimes I work on art that I love, but I also work on art that I am interested in that I wouldn't necessarily want to hang in my house. That is like, something that has always guided a lot of my scholarship. Whereas I have some friends where it's like, they only work on the things that they would want to like surround themselves with all the time. So one of my favorite works in the MFA's collection is actually one of our great icons, which is Watson and the Shark, which I could talk about until I died. Do you know that painting?
Do you know that one, Grace?
I don't think so. We're going to look it up now.
I can pull it up. I'm going to pull it up. It's one of our great sort of icons. And it's like, it's funny because actually right now I see that there's a couple of different versions of it, and I see that the DC version is actually coming up first. Don't pay attention to that. But but yeah, so it's it's this painting of the guy with the shark. So it's a great icon of our collection by John Singleton Copley. So maybe if I click MFA, yeah, here we go. So this, you can see this, yes, this guy with the shark. This painting has fascinated people forever, like pretty much since it was first made. And Copley was primarily a portrait painter. So he made our portrait of Paul Revere. And as someone who grew up here in colonial Boston, he wanted like nothing more than to go to like real art school, like in England, right? So it's pretty soon after he like marries a loyalist. When he was here in Boston, he painted portraits of both loyalists and Tories, but he marries a loyalist and moves to London. And one of the first paintings he makes is Watson and the Shark. So that is what we often refer to those sort of grand scenes as history paintings, but that sort of category of painting, history paintings, would normally only be reserved for things that mattered to lots of people, like scenes from the Bible or, war scenes or something. And Watson and the Shark was really only important to Watson, the person who commissioned that painting. He, as a young man, fell from he went swimming and was attacked by a shark. And John Singleton Copley managed to dramatize that scene so much that it looked like it should have been a scene from the Bible or a scene from a great war, but it was really, as one of my professors said, like a childhood swimming accident. And so the sort of richness of that painting is really important to me. The fact that he had such a vision for transforming a personal incident into something that feels, when you look at it, like something that affects all of us is incredibly powerful. And also the fact that Copley is someone who's associated with Boston and he's associated with London, but that painting is actually set in Cuba. So that he never went to Cuba. And if you look at the painting, he clearly never saw a shark. But that painting also has a Latin American history associated with it that I also hope we can continue to draw out more. So thank you for that question. I'm sorry it took me so long to answer. It's one I fear that question for that very reason.
All right. Thank you so much. I was lost in space somewhere, and so I apologize, and I'm finally back. We have time for one last question.
I have one question to ask you, and I don't think I heard it. With a lot of countries wanting their artwork back, does the MFA dealing with an issue of Latin American countries wanting to bring the art to you, or are they wanting art back?
That's a really important question. So the MFA, we are very fortunate at the MFA in that we have a full-time curator of provenance. So provenance is the story of an object's life from when it leaves the artist's hands all the way to when it winds up, in our case, in a museum. And so she is more of a specialist in Nazi looted art. So you may have also heard stories about that, or some of you might be familiar with the Monuments Men stories about families, Jewish families who were forced or coerced to get rid of their objects or to sell their objects during the Nazi era. And much of that has been returned, or there have been sort of negotiations around what stays with collections. And so there are rules that govern Nazi looted art and indigenous art. So here in the United States, we have NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, that all museums have to be compliant with that. And in Latin America, it is less clear. So we have to research the provenance of every object, and other countries can make claims and they can ask for things back. So we have a sort of specialist on staff who deals with any of those claims, of which we don't have any, currently that are open. But yes, it is always a possibility. And one of the questions that we have had recently, especially as we've started working with more and more Native and Indigenous people, is about funerary objects. So objects like, even if they don't ask for them back, if it's funerary, should we have it in a museum? These are really, really challenging questions. And they go as much for, you know, some of the Maya ceramic art as they do for the mummies. You know, I think like we're really in a moment when American and European institutions are having to think very deeply about the colonial foundations of these institutions and how we sort of move forward. So yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a really complicated one. We're lucky to have talented folks on staff who think deeply and thoughtfully about these things.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Layla, for that deep dive into the art of the Americas. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. And thank you, Layla, for continuing to like host while I was lost in space. I'm glad we had those
Thank you all
questions set up
so
for you.
much. Yeah, no, thank you so much for your time and for the great questions and for the discussion. So please come visit us at the museum.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Have a good night.